Good morning, everyone. I don't think I have any sound. Morning, no. Morning, oh, that works, sorry. Too well. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second week at the joint MDB Pavilion. So my name is Noelle O'Brien. I'm Director of Climate Change at the Asian Development Bank, and I'm here together with my colleague Orgo Sinha Roy, who is for this session on locally led adaptation. So for the last 5 years, ADB has been organizing an annual discussion on opportunities for scaling up local level adaptation, which continues to help and shape our work through the Community Resilience Partnership Program. And let me recognize our partners who have been involved with CRPP, the Huaru Commission, IIED, UK FCDO, the French Development Agency, GCF, and the Nordic Development Fund. CRPP has been working to scale local level adaptation through government systems by building the evidence base, community and institutional capacities, and designing and investing in pro-poor solutions that address the nexus of climate, poverty, and gender. And so we're very keen to hear from countries and our partners on issues related to scaling local adaptation, what investments might be needed, and the role of MDBs in pursuing this agenda, and particularly as we look forward to the delivery of the Baku to Belém Roadmap. So we're a small, cozy group. So if you're planning to stay for the session, can I ask you to come up and pull in a chair so that this can be a small circle conversation as opposed to you being the audience. So thanks a lot. Orgo, over to you.
Thank you, Noel. Hello, please join us. You can move in front, it's okay. Yeah, this is a conversation. Actually, to me, I often find the small groups are the most interesting discussions because you can be frank and you can have a conversation. There's no script over here. So it's very, very informal. I do want to start with a question. I don't know how many of us have read the Baku to Belém Roadmap. There is a chapter on adaptation and resilience in that. And one of the recommendations is to support local-led adaptation, reach scale, by doing 3 things. One is having dedicated programs or windows. Second is improving access for countries, which you guys work a lot. And third is to make sure fiscal transfers from national to local also factors in resilience considerations in addition to other factors. So what we really wanted to discuss today is, if we want local level adaptation to reach scale, what's required? But to begin with, it's important to understand what does scale mean to each one of us. So very happy to have with us today somebody from a grassroots organization, Yakum, which works with Grassroots Women's Group in Indonesia. Thanks, Sekar, for joining us. We've got Catherine from AFD, which is a financial institution, Lenny from Government of Philippines, a government perspective, and Paul from IIED, a global think. Maybe I'm going to start for you, Sekar. What does scale mean to you from a grassroots perspective? Thank you.
Test. Thank you, Argo, for the opportunity and also for inviting me to these sessions. It's my honor to be here. I'm from Yakum Emergency Unit based in Indonesia. So we are a national NGO working humanitarian and climate change adaptations. And yeah, when we're talking about scale, we think that it's not always about expanding a project. It's not always expanding or replicating. Indeed, scale means that it would be the form of strengthened the capacity and system and structure, and also how that the community that we are working with will be able to continue to sustain the approach, the principles of, for example, the locally led adaptations in their context. So it's not about like always like expanding more in the wider community, but it's more on the strengthen on the structure and the systems and the actor as well.
Great. So it's more about, for you, it's more about going deeper into the system and strengthening the system. Lenny, from a national government's perspective, what does scale means to you?
Thanks, Hugo, and happy to be part of the panel. So from us at the national government level, of course, we aim to have alignment of the local adaptation actions with our national adaptation plan. So for us to do that, we should be able to localize the NAP, focusing on, of course, providing access to funds at the local level, undertaking capacity development work, and involving more of the communities, all the stakeholders from local government to academia to the private sector at the local level in the work. So our NAP has 8 priority sectors, and scaling for us would mean that many of the actors on the ground are focusing on activating the work under those 8 priority areas. And of course, from the national government perspective, providing the enabling environment to be able to, for local actors to take advanced adaptation actions.
Thank you. So it's more about, I guess, bringing stakeholders together so you can aggregate the work, the outcomes of it. And as a national government, to provide the right enabling environments the local actors, communities, businesses can take up. Catherine, from your perspective as AFG, a financial institution, what does scale means?
Yeah, thank you. For us, the scales is how we pass from little pilot, innovative demonstration on the ground to working at the national level and implement more systematically this finance. So it's more how, as a public development bank, we can bring the good practices, but also the fiduciary systems at scale. So how we pass through the national governments to work up to the communities with at the right level, basically.
Strengthening the fiduciary system so that ultimately the national government support can reach a local level. Paul, from you?
So I think we need to take almost one step back before we talk about scale. I think we almost need to think about the terms we're using, right? And so if we're talking about local level adaptation, then I think we're already at scale, right? We've got decades of experience with often donor-driven or national policy-driven top-down approaches to adaptation at a local level, right? There's countless examples of adaptation occurring in communities. But if we're talking about locally led adaptation, when communities are 100% in the driver's seat of the decision-making, controlling resources for their own adaptation journeys, then it's a much earlier time. And I think we have some challenges to scale with that model, and happy to talk a lot more about that. And I think we probably need to land somewhere in the middle, right? Like we need to think about how locally led we can be in every context, but we don't need to be locally led in every context. So matching that bottom-up and top-down structures and approaches to enable sustainable long-term adaptation at the community level that is in large part driven by the community's needs and desires.
So find the right balance between top-down and bottom-up in the context of LLA you're talking about, with the principles at the heart of it. I do want to turn to audience. Anybody over here has any other perspective of what would scale mean for taking local level adaptation? Yes, please. You can come and join us. You can leave in between. No problem. It's fine.
No, just a quick listening to all of you, and especially our colleague from Indonesia, and the the national government representative. I think that one aspect that we should mention when scaling up locally led adaptation initiatives is South-to-South collaboration. I think we have I'm from GNDR, the Global Network for Disaster Reduction. We have a very good experience in making sure that our members share their best practices. Again, to do that, to identify what are those middle ground key aspects in which we need to focus on and invest to make sure that, yeah, that top-down, bottom-up kind of institutionalized decentralization happens to make sure that there is a proper environment for locally led adaptation initiatives. But I think that the component of South to South or component of local organizations sharing their knowledge, sharing their experience for others to adapt that to their own context is really important. And there is a huge lack of funding for that, to do that. So I think, yeah, that component would be important for myself.
I think that's very important. And going back to you, what you suggested, how can the national government, as a part of the enabling environment, allow or facilitate local communities to share with each other within the country, within your district or provinces? I think that's an important mechanism. Do you want to add to it from you before I come back?
All right. So no, thank you very much. And it's been really great hearing everyone. What I want to emphasize is that it's not a static solution. It works as a loop. So I'm with the Commonwealth Secretariat, and we do have our Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, whereby we embed long-term experts, so Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisors. Now, even though they're national advisors, depending on the country requests, they have to engage whole of society. So it depends on what it is you're looking at. For example, in Fiji, we did work with the local community for nature-based seawalls, that kind of project. Now, at the national level, for example, in Uganda, we're working at the national carbon market. But in all of these situations, you have to understand what it is you're addressing and bringing in the right stakeholders at the right time, but connecting them, you know, and matching the instruments and the resources. One last point is even in terms of geography. So because of where we sit, our 56 member countries, we actually have the largest economies in terms of population size and also the smallest. So some of our countries, the state governments are as big or as small as some countries in themselves. So we do also see parallels to be drawn. And that's the point you were saying about peer-to-peer learning. So we do a lot of institutional support as well in that regard.
Great, thank you. Before I come to you, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Harrison from Cameroon. I work with an NGO called Ajesh, and we're a member of GNDR. Just to queue up with the others to say there is absolute need for real documentation of country-led approaches, because there are so many activities going on, and they're all operating in silos. At country level, we should look at the possibility of harmonizing these initiatives from both community level and bringing at the community to top level, so that there should be a synergy of information from the community level to the government, because as we speak, most of the situation, especially in Africa, the government is doing its own thing, the NGOs are doing theirs, and there is no point of synergy. So we should look at building synergies before we get into these South-South exchanges, because the COP, you find the government of a country saying something else, the NGOs are saying something else, and there's no correlation of information. So we should look at building these synergies where we have this bottom-top information, bottom-top, and with a harmonized information system, such that when we're doing South-to-South exchanges, there should be a correlation of information, but so that we move away from silos. And then the other part I want to talk is our policies. Most of the discussions we're having are in most countries not in their policies. So it makes it a bit very challenging to adapt or for the government to buy into some very good initiatives. So we should be looking at how do we also inform the decision makers to get into policies. But to the fact that we all understand, especially in the developing countries, most of the policies are still having colonialistic tendencies. We need to decolonize that and pull down the fortress around all of these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take one more before I move to the panelists.
Thank you. Scale for us. I'm from Madagascar, and we are implementing adaptation at local level. But scale means as well, in the case of Madagascar, it's a big island. We have different climate risks, climate threats, climate situation, and fountain as well. And scale means that we have as well to understand what others that are in the same situation are doing. It's not just working locally and not looking at others. And that's why we're here, right, at COP. It's as well to learn from what the others are doing in the same situation. And I do agree with all of what was said in terms of bottom-up. In general, when NGOs like us are implementing projects, we do tend to bring the strategy instead of asking communities what, for example, are their resilience capacity. And then we have to document lesson learned and best practices for us to replicate those locally led adaptation, ensuring that what have been done in one area can be used in other areas as well, but as well the mistakes, failure you did in some region that have the same will not be replicated by others. So scale means really learning what have been done, testing as well, but it needs to be bottom up. And Indonesia was saying earlier that we have to address that system level as well, because most of the time rules and regulation or some climate change are made at higher level that is not adapted to the context. And the context is really important. For the case of Madagascar, you have the east coasts that are tropical, southern is arid. So what we do south will not be able to be replicated in the east. And so the system, the laws and regulation needs to address all those aspects as well. So for us, scale means sharing, learning, but most importantly, contextualizing all those aspects, especially in adaptation, to ensure resilience at community level and then at scale level. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, you want to add something quickly?
So just one more thing in terms of scale, so means of implementation, right? And you look at finance. Increasingly, you hear and we know that you need both public sector and private sector finance. Now, we need to be careful, especially when we're talking about private sector. Increasingly, we've seen that for private sector, especially for countries that do not have markets that are well established, the major private sector practitioners, especially capital markets, are not able to engage. And that is what people consider as private sector engagement generally. But that shouldn't stop there, because we have many of our countries, especially when you're engaging local communities, that do not engage with the traditional private sector engagement and should not be left behind. So when we are advocating and bringing in private sector, they need to be able to understand that private sector is not homogeneous. It should not just be only one kind of solution, but those that meet the requirements of communities. And it should not be kept or pegged at the traditional markets that we have now. Thank you.
Great point, Uzo. Thank you. So I think it's interesting because the way we looked at it, so I would then go back. If somebody wants to support a local grassroots organizations reach scale, so if it's about going deeper, which requires much more longer term patient funding, it is not necessarily activity driven funding, but more about organization, system strengthening, institutional strengthening. Whereas Catherine, you talked about, fiduciary systems. So for a financial institution that's supporting national governments reach scale, it could be more about aligning funding with the fiduciary system and the fiscal transfer mechanism. So money is going to local level in a manner that's sustainable. And for a national government point of view, it's maybe about introducing certain reforms that allows you to bring different stakeholders together with a common mandate or working at the local level. So I think it's interesting how this can be unpacked. I will go back to Lenny and Sekar, both of you. Philippines government has got many national mechanisms that can support local level adaptation. Can you explain what those mechanisms are? And same way, I'll ask you about your Community Resilience Fund, which is one mechanism of supporting, then we can have a chat around that.
Thanks, Argo. So in the Philippines, I can cite 3 examples on what we're doing in this regard. So one is that we have a People Survival Fund. So it's a local adaptation fund. It has actually a law that institutionalizes this. So this is an annual fund at around $17 million out of the General Appropriations Fund of the government. So it's only provided to local level actors. So that's the local government, local stakeholders, academia, and other practitioners on the ground, our people's organizations, for example. So this is replenished every year. In 2017, the management of this was transferred to the Climate Change Commission, to the Department of Finance, and it was during this time that it was strengthened. To date, the fund that was provided in 2024 is already used up or already allocated to projects, and the screening for the 2025 projects are being undertaken. What is important? Why this is important? Because it provides a mechanism for direct access by local actors to this fund. It does go through a screening process, but this screening process, there's a board that's composed of not only national but also local government, CSOs and the private sector that does the screening for this. And the only maybe constraint or gap that is existing now, because we are receiving more proposals for funding under this fund than we have the money for. So at this time, we have a study by the UNDP that tries to understand how to bring it up to scale, how maybe other entities, MDBs, for example, and other financing institutions can come in to complement the fund that the government provides. So this is an ongoing conversation that we have now. The second one that I can share is the work that's being done by our Department of Social Welfare and Development. So they have a committee-driven project where they give out directly also to communities which co-create projects that respond to their needs. So they tap under that small grants funding under that overall project to implement this. Maybe a third one that I can also share is about our program convergence budgeting that's happening at the national level. It's an interagency effort. For example, the one being handled by our Department of Planning, it looks into catching up on lagging SDGs, and they have this pot of money that comes out from the excise taxes from tobacco, liquor, etc. They put it there and ask agencies to propose projects for funding under SDG 13 and the other SDGs. There's also a program convergence budget on specifically to water, because water is important to us. There's also a lot of green infrastructure that's happening under this budget mechanism. And finally, my ministry, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, will also manage a fund. This is for the Risk and Resiliency Program, which looks into disaster risk reduction and adaptation work. And it's not similar to the ones with pooled funds, but it's more or less trying to track where the budgets go from the General Appropriations Funds, and our Department of Budget and Management tracks this if these are indeed implemented. That the ones that approved budget on are really the ones that go into this convergence budgeting.
Thanks, Lenny. Before I come to you, Sekar. So the People Survival Fund, to my understanding, is very few fund that is entrenched in the national legislation for climate change legislation. It already identifies it, which means a government is required to have annual transfer of $17 million, right? Of course, you're saying that's not enough, and we know that. So, Paul, can I just come to you? I'm going off script over here now. Why can't we then work with global climate funds to channel financing through an existing mechanism that, of course, can be strengthened? That's fine, instead of trying to have separate projects. In the case of Philippines, let's say, what are barriers for that, and how can we make it happen?
I mean, the short answer is we can, right? And we should. And I think there are examples where some of the vertical funds, the multilateral climate funds, have supported national mechanisms, but it's still rare. And I think part of it is around the requirements for accreditation in the first instance. And so in this case, the ministry would need to be the accredited entity to, say, the Green Climate Fund. But it's not just the basic accreditation that you need, right? It's got to be the particular project size accreditation, and every time you ramp up a size, it requires a much deeper level of accreditation, fiduciary management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then beyond that, you then need to achieve what they call on-granting accreditation, by which you need to already be able to prove that you're doing it, which you are, but the kinds of documentation that's required can be a barrier. So, I mean, you're talking, you know, minimum 12 months, maybe longer for the accreditation process, particularly if there's a long queue of entities waiting to go through the process. There's only a handful of people processing them. And then from there, it's a proposal development process, right? And we know the concept note takes about a year, and then we know the full proposal development takes about a year, and then it takes 9 months to get to approval. And so we're talking 4 years, even if you started now, before you're going to see those funds flow. And it's absolutely worth doing, because the funding that you can leverage out of those mechanisms is substantial, but the burden on institutions that may already have some capacity constraints is immense. And so finding partners that can help you navigate that process, I think, is really important. So I think there's philosophically no barrier, and there's, in some sense, procedurally no barrier, and it's exactly what everybody wants to see. But there's a whole bunch of, you know, hundreds of policy level barriers or procedural barriers that mean it takes a really long time. And so what we need to find is ways to cut through that timeline, basically.
Yeah, but even if it's long term, it's still worth investing in, because the fund is a nationally driven system. It will not dry off soon. It has to be there. So I guess it's worth. Catherine, I'm going to come to you. You know, from an AFD point of view, some of the examples that Lenny gave. So it's a national government fund which we can capitalize, for example, or if they have certain governments reforms that's pulling in money, we can have policy-based lending around those. So how would you see supporting Philippines government's examples to ramp up local level adaptation?
Yeah, thank you very much. I found the example very interesting, and the fact that these national embedded tools is really, really interesting. And I'm wondering why the access of GCF, if you have already tried, or I would be happy to learn more about it, because what I can see in other kind of national funds that have been setting up also, the question of the mobilizations from the national government is also a question. So there is some strategies where such kind of dedicated local investments are sought or are set up to target adaptation fund, for instance. But there is also a lot of other countries where the strategies, when we as a partners, we came saying, look, we can invest, but maybe you can go to GCF, etc. At the national strategy, the strategy for going for the GCF is another priorities. And I don't know the case of the Philippines, but I would be really interested to know about, when you're speaking about this amount of money, this climate vertical fund, there is also some priorities that can be more recognized to be more important for the country than such kind of fund support. So, and it's the same for us and our loan. So we come saying, you can take a loan for adaptations. Look, we think this mechanism is interesting. Would you be able? We are in Mauritania, in discussion in Mauritania exactly on these questions. So maybe you can take a loan on this decentralization funding that you are really interested. And the government has many priorities, and fair enough, on adaptations in terms of investment, etc., and would be much more willing to get a loan on infrastructures, or at least we have such conversation about where is the priorities. So I don't know what is going to be in Mauritania or in Rwanda, but you have to have in mind that when coming to access of this vertical fund, it's also a national choices, and the priority might shift also about the use of different funds.
Thanks. Sekar, I'll come to you now to talk about the Community Resilience Fund, but Emma, I'll come back to you a little bit. In the Pacific also, many governments are setting up these national funds. So what would be your view, support them? Maybe after Indonesia, maybe. Noel, just, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I think some of you already mentioned the principles about the how the or that resources could be used in the local level, and there's a tools or approach introduced by Huari Commissions called Community Resilient Fund. So in short, it is flexible and self-managed funds that provided to a community for them to identify what is the risk, the vulnerabilities, and what is their priority to address on the climate risk. So I think that this kind of tools and approach is also promotes how the locally led adaptations, because the process of the Community Resilient Fund is how the community, especially women, are empowered to understand what is the risk and the underlying drivers of the vulnerabilities of the climate risk, and then they develop their priorities, their agendas, as well as to identify the the gaps on the government processes and mechanism where they are taking part on mobilizing, and also they're taking part on monitoring on that, and to identify who is the most at risk and most vulnerable that should be targeted on the such programs. And when we talk about the locally led adaptations, the critical points of these funds is also it based on the data driven. So for example, we have to conduct a series of capacity building and strengthening on how to understand the risk, the vulnerable, the assessment with the local actors, with the community, the most at risk, so that they can develop the resilience actions as well as their anticipatory actions, so that they can better prepare on to be more resilient in terms of the climate risk.
Can I ask you one follow-up question? When you give money to the women's group,
Yeah.
what percentage of the money goes for actual activities, and what percentage goes towards organization, capacity building, software element, which are also very important?
Yeah, that's very interesting questions, because when we discuss with the women's group, there are various way of using that funds. But principally, the women's group will allocate that funds into the capacity building, the capital for their run like a resilience actions, or like a small scale business that make sure that they are the most at risk participate in the such actions, and also the social funds and emergency funds. They can also use that in fact that they use the profit of the funds to manage for example, the anticipatory actions that we are doing in the local level. It's not only about how to being resilient in long term, but how they can also manage the fund for the disaster preparedness.
Sure.
Yeah. So for example, like 30% for the capacity building, and then more for managing the resilience actions, and also for taking care for the others, for the most vulnerable
Emergency.
groups. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move to Emma. Emma is a Director General for us for the Pacific Department. In the Pacific, many countries are establishing this resilience fund. Even RMI has done, others. So what is your view, Emma, in terms of supporting such funds? Yeah, thanks.
To me, there's two issues. There's two big issues in supporting the funds. And one is around the good governance of the funds. So are they on budget or off budget? And if they're out of the budget, what's in place to make sure funds go to where they should and who they should, and to monitor that process. Now, that's something that is able to be relatively easily done, but it has to be recognized and there has to be willingness to do it from the outset. But I think the other really important factor is what type of money is going into those funds. Where I work in the Pacific, many of the countries will only take grants from us. Although we're a bank, we also have a grant window that goes to countries that are a high risk of debt distress. That's many of the Pacific Islands. And so countries need to access grant funds for this. Grant funds are limited, so that becomes more complicated perhaps than borrowing to fill up some of these funds. Countries that are in a position to borrow to put money into the funds also need to think about where that money is going and how it's going to be repaid, and either have processes to do that or to only invest in things that have revenue streams, which makes it very difficult to use the loan funds to invest in many, many important community development needs to respond to climate. So I think the financing governance is really important to think of upfront so that you can do what you want to do with these funds.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Emma. Do you want to come in, please?
Yes, I'd want just to comment on two specific aspects. One is as international NGOs, for us it's quite complicated to access finance. When it comes, let's say GCF, for example, it took almost 3 years just for the accreditation. But the other parties, we cost more money than a local organization. In case of Madagascar, we have 3 accredited entities for GCF, UN, and then WFNCI. We cost a lot of money. And so about 30 to 40% of the funding actually goes directly to the organization that is implementing it without supporting much the communities. So when we talk about local adaptation, we need as well to maybe facilitate some of the process for local organization to access directly to those funding, not always channeled for the government. For example, CRS in Sudan, we have direct funding from World Bank, meaning that we can actually channel those to local organization directly without having all the levels. And it as well can remove some of the capacity of the government to actually deliver the activities. So when we discuss about local adaptation, we need as well to adapt those type of funding. Banks should look at how they can facilitate access for local organization, and maybe organization like us could play as kind of insurance for the money to actually go directly to the community, so that we remove some of the really complicated aspect. 2 years ago, GCF came to Madagascar, and then they had about 15 or 20 local organization, and none of them had the capacity to actually be accredited because of financial capacity, risk management, etc.
Yeah.
And so those are really complicated. And so the money is not going, grants especially, debt, of course, that needs to be channeled for the government. But but grants, for example, is really complex because of the cost of us, our large organization. And in Asia, for example, CRS has this kind of money directly, but it's through the government, meaning that what we receive as an organization is already lower than the grants or the debt, and then we have to pass it to local organization, meaning that we have a lot of cost, indirect cost, not associated to any of the implementation, and that's probably system level change at government level locally, but as well at bank or at donors level, to make sure that any money, any penny we spend is going towards supporting local adaptation.
Thank you. So I think very interesting. So we talked about scale first. We talked about existing programs. How do you support that? With the last part is going to be, so what I hear is that it is not so a single kind of solution it has been much more nuanced. Of course, we want to support local level adaptation, hopefully through the principles of LLA. So do we need a mechanism where there is consistent availability of grant, technical assistance money to do the kind of system building, capacity building, organization kind of work, which is very important and should be there, almost kind of not earmarked. But then you have a range of activities which is more the ones that will not generate revenue, but is equally important and should be financed through grant mechanisms, primarily adaptation fund, GCF kind of work. But there could be some activities at the local level which has opportunities of local market development, like climate smart agriculture kind of work, where one can think about providing some level of concessional financing that can be paid back, and you can channel it through women's cooperatives as revolving funds, things like that. So maybe a kind of a layered financing mechanism also. I don't know what views you guys would be. Maybe Catherine, I can start with you, having something which is more layered and nuanced depending on the investability of the activities.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting idea, this idea of layering. I was more thinking about the a non-tree with type of partners, but I think that I was thinking the same, listening what was shared. In Pacific, we do have an initiative called Kiwa that is only grants for NGOs to get access directly to grants for innovating on adaptation and locally led adaptation. So it's only nature-based solution for adaptation and investment. So I do think there is such kind of areas where we can innovate. We need to systematically support this innovation through grants, maybe through NGOs, because the government doesn't have time or money to dedicate to this. And the NGOs, because of their network, also international network, can use it as learning, etc. And then there is, I quite agree with the other the other layering you mentioned. Just saying that I think there is opportunities. So on the other layering you mentioned, I do agree. I would just highlight that for the private sectors, I think that it's not only at the local level but also at the country level that there is opportunities for market project and loan project. So I do think that some innovation at the local level with private sector, formal or informal, is possible, but you can do that at scale by supporting like the public national development banks, etc. So that's why I was more thinking about actors and which players can do that, but it's going to your layering. And then in terms of loans, I do think that we can also have public loans that can fund more systematic action. So the GCF is not the only areas where the country can go through. I think that national mobilization of the funds and loans can be solutions. We just need to find the way. And we do not have so much experience on this, like loan for local action. But through our public policy-based loan, we still have some part of this national embedding. So I do think that we can have such kind of tools and funding at all scales working, but we need to be specific about what we call local and with whom we are speaking when you are doing that for each mechanisms, actors, and type of support. I will do this sequencing.
No, but very useful. And going back to what Emma was saying, so I don't think what we mean over here is loan doesn't necessarily mean the money that's going to local level is also loan. The loan is at the national level, but that also means the government has some domestic resource mobilization plans in place to pay back for the loan, but the money that they're giving to local level is actually still grant money, right? If I go back to you, and I'm totally off script, I know that very well over here. So, so you talked about the PSF before. We talked about the possibility of capitalization, the PSF. But can you see that in the PSF, when you capitalize, there'll be some set of actors providing grant money to PSF so that you can on grants to local governments, CSOs for software activities. But then some actors can provide some concessional borrowing money, which goes to local level in form of grant, but for activities that can generate market, like in agriculture sector. So do you see a mechanism which is more layered, more nuanced, work in the Philippines context?
I think that's an opportunity and potential. The Ministry of Environment, actually, we are already doing that because we're targeting to provide water to island villages, island. So what we're doing now is to match them to some donor or partner that provides for example, desalination facility, but we don't give them directly as grant because, of course, we pay for that first. But we ask them to form an organization, maybe a women's group, where this can be a form of money-making endeavor, like people pay for, of course, clean water in those areas, and then they can pay back the loan after. And for us to be able also to support other villages because of that effort. So that can be done like in the case of what we're doing now.
Great. Second, in the Indonesia context, you also have a nationwide adaptation program, which I can't remember the name now. Is it not SIDIC? The one by Ministry of Environment? Proclaim, yes, yes. So in that kind of a program, what role do you see of grassroots organizations can play?
Yeah. Proclaim is a program for the community can document their adaptations effort. So it's more on the data collections and then to see the progress of how community can be more resilient. And there are some inputs and suggestions and also some analysis that we discussed with the women's groups and also the community on how Proclaim should also could provide the flexible fund because it's more on the documentations and not on the resources management. So I think what we discussed on the how funds can be mobilized in terms of in form of investment in the community is also very important. The government program that we are also observing is something that is in the in the form of the village fund and also the village enterprise unit where they are right now is mandated to the village fund allocate 20% of the funds for the food security and adaptations. But in fact that the program still has no a specific approach on adaptations. So it's more on the how community can access fund in form of the loans and investment. But I think that we are working with the community right now is to influence and also to have a dialogue on how we strengthen the programs, the systems that right now are in place with the perspective and also with the approach that can strengthen the activities, the programs to be informed by the climate risk. So I think that's gonna be what we will work on that, and it is also how the data-driven mechanism, like how people collecting the data, identify the most at risk, and also make a clear visions on how it connect between the gender equality, climate adaptations, and also poverty reduction. So it's the important thing between those aspects on how the community can better access and be accountable for managing the fund to be targeted the most at risk with the climate adaptation framework.
Great, and for those who don't know, Proclaim is a nationwide program in Indonesia that engages communities in collecting data on vulnerability itself. And then the Village Fund is a decentralized mechanism which provides funding to village level for various things, including adaptation security. Paul, I'm going to come to you last. So we discussed a little bit about this unpacking, layering, whatever you want to call it, sequencing. Any views, any bright ideas on that?
I don't know about bright ideas, but I have like 72 points that I would love to make, particularly in response to some of the really interesting comments that have come in from the audience. But I think that the layering is, I mean, really first on the layering, I think the thing is, all of those layers are already there, right, in various ways, and we've got multiple kinds of mechanisms already operating in the same places or in similar places. And what we don't have, and I think what we've never had and what we've always needed, and we talk about a lot, is coordination, right? And so the boring stuff is really, really important and helps us think through what's useful for a loan, what's useful for a grant, where are the needs. So some kind of strategic overview, I think, is really important to think through what kind of resources do we deploy, where, for what purpose, under whose control, to respond to what kind of issues. And, you know, that's something that shouldn't be that hard to do, but it is, right? I think that the other things to ponder are thinking about always keeping in mind the people that markets don't care about, right? Or that markets don't reach. The most vulnerable, the poorest, the people who are in highly climate vulnerable contexts, and how we can ensure that they're not left behind, that they're not kind of, you know, left out of the process. We hear so much about private sector finance coming in. At the end of the day, currently, of all of the private sector flows for adaptation, for climate finance, 2% of it flows to adaptation, right? It's almost nothing. We need to scale it up substantially, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't leave people behind. And I think one of the things that probably has the most substantial gain, when we think about, just a short analogy, energy efficiency, right? Being one of the most important mitigation actions we can take. It's not very sexy or very interesting making sure that your fridge seals are clean, for example, right? And your appliances are running efficiently, but it's incredibly important. I think it's the same thing for adaptation. One of the most important investments that we can make is thinking about where we're deploying public capital in a way that is actually duplicating what the private sector should already be doing, right? We're spending money to influence the private sector to do stuff they already want to do. So if we can stop doing that, it will free up substantial resources that we can then deploy for the most at risk, the most vulnerable, with no strings attached.
I agree, but I think, you know, from my perspective, I'm not very optimistic about private sector financing local level adaptation. But the question is, if you invest in local level adaptation, can it help create local market in some cases? And then that market is financing some of the resilience measures moving forward because it's for local benefit. I think that's what is worth unpacking. We are almost rushing time, but I would end with maybe one last question to each one of you. Maybe Catherine, I'm going to start with you. Based on the discussion today we had, and as Noel mentioned, we have made it deliberate for the last 5 COPs that every COP we have this conversation on local level adaptation. I think that consistency is also important for us to have it, no matter if there are no participants available, that's fine, I guess. But from your perspective, of course, you're supporting CRPP, but where do you see, based on this conversation, something that we can work with AFD moving forward on local adaptation?
Yeah, thank you. I think that we have now a community of practice that has been set up with donors since the last 2 years.
Yes, yeah.
And it's been quite a major effort, but I think now we know each other, we start to work with each other, and we know better each other thanks to the meeting we had in Stockholm. So I do think that it's already a step. So I would say now let's deliver a project together.
Together.
And I think we mentioned already cooperation that we might have in Bangladesh, maybe in Philippines, where we have 2 nice projects on policy-based loan for ocean and an adaptation, where I do see there is a lot of synergies we can find. So I think that we just need to sit and to discuss where we want to invest together. We are also trying to deploy our adaptation program in Pacific, so that can be also areas where we do find a lot of synergies, including synergies with our overseas territories, where we have also French mechanisms on locally led actions that we can maybe share or duplicate. Just would like to conclude by echoing your introduction on the Baku to Belém. In Baku to Belém, there is an interesting paragraph, we found very interesting paragraph on transformative finance, transformational finance,
Yes.
and catalytic finance. None of these paragraphs are mentioning locally led. I do think that the best way we can support locally led adaptation is to make this finance, transformational finance agenda to be sensitive or to include locally led adaptation, because we will not do transformational finance at scale without including this locally led approach. So for me, the way we are moving on this transformational finance agenda is really good, and we can include that. Like, we need to maybe jump on this train.
Thanks, Sekar. So how can we support you guys better?
Yeah. Yeah, of course, because we are working closely with the community and grassroots women leaders. So I think on how we can linkage the expertise of the women in the local level, how they have succeed in influence programs should be promoted to the wider and then higher level, for example, in the national level. So to promote, to introduce the pilots, how they conduct the adaptations, local adaptations, and how they manage and mobilize the resilience fund. It should be introduced to our local national government, and how conduct the dialogue on how it can be leveraged in a more system level and structure, so it can be more transformational for the local community, but as well for the government.
Thank you. I also think the importance of supporting pilots through you guys, not just to support you, but also for us to learn from those pilots on what's working. Then we have discussion with clients, we can take forward those learnings. Philippines, Lenny, what can we do to help you?
Government cannot do it alone.
Yes.
So adaptation is an all of society effort. So what is important for us would be the ownership of the local community, be it adaptation action introduced by the national government or being initiated by them. We need them to own it and work with us.
Thank you so much. Increasing ownership of communities. Paul, what can we work together more on?
I think that the magic is already here, right? And you've assembled a really interesting group of people that are thinking through these issues in different ways. And I guess maybe back to the question of scale being sort of the driver of the conversation. I think when we're talking about kind of pure locally led adaptation, right, which is sort of where we've started. We have this set of 8 principles, and there's a thriving community of practice, the donor one obviously, but a much broader community of practice. And the conversations there are generally about how we do more of the pure kind of LLA at scale. And I think that's quite complicated, right? And we're at a point now where everybody's talking about locally led approaches, right? It's probably the buzz phrase of this COP. But what it takes to move that into practice is really complicated. And I think we probably need to take a step down from the plinth that we're on and think about a more practical approach to locally led adaptation that is implementable at scale. So I guess my last point would be to do that. When we're talking about working or being community-led at the very local level, it's necessarily small scale, right? You can't put tens of millions of dollars into a community of 300 people, right? It just isn't practical. But I think there's ways that we can think about scale a little bit differently. So one to me is duration. So it's not about putting bucket loads of money into a community on a very short time scale and expecting them to absorb it and use it effectively. It's committing to a long-term process, 10 years, where you start perhaps small and you build that core institutional capacity. And as that capacity increases, the flows to do stuff with that capacity can then increase over time. So that's one. And then I think the other one is around aggregation, right? So we need intermediaries, even though it does increase costs, I think it also can increase efficiency, who can aggregate up all of these kind of small investments that are going on and make them packageable and palatable to these large sources of finance, like the ADB, like the GCF, who work in numbers that are way too big for any individual community, to then be able to take that amount of finance and then do useful things with it. So I think that's kind of my key message on scale at the end of the day, is we have to keep it anchored at the local level, but we also need to think about how that fits into a global finance picture that moves in numbers with lots of zeros.
Thank you. Thank you all of you for a very enjoyable and cerebral conversation, and for being a very big sport. I went totally off script after the first question, so thanks for that. I think we have much to discuss and unpack. We take it forward, so I will not synthesize it, and we just look forward to continuing discussion and working with all of you. So thanks a lot.